I'm honored to have this opportunity to share with the Mondays at Beinecke audience this most unusual and very inspirational story from 19th century New Haven. Previous research and writing on Mary Ann Goodman was done by Yale's chief research archivist, Judith Ann Schiff. My subsequent work, represented here, came about in response to many inquiries I've received through the years for more information. It is a continuation of Judy's work, and therefore I dedicate this to her memory. While already engaged in my research, I was further inspired by a short documentary produced by Tobias Cropper of the Divinity Library. It is entitled, What Could Have Been America's First HBCU, and I highly recommend you watch it on Beinecke's YouTube channel. It is the story about the efforts of a group of free Black citizens, along with some white abolitionists led by the Reverend Simeon S. Jocelyn, to establish a college for young African Americans in New Haven. Had they been successful, this would have been the first historically Black college in the country. Though it covered Reverend Jocelyn's subsequent efforts with the American Missionary Association to provide educational opportunities for the emancipated, the documentary focused on the hard truths of historic New Haven that we've come to expect, the good, the bad, and the downright ugly truth of race relations in the 19th century. I assure you that there is nothing bad nor ugly about the story of Mrs. Mary Ann, the good woman of New Haven. I have dug deeply, archivally, and even archaeologically, and I am pleased to share this story with you. Is this a story of biblical proportions, fashioned after the widow with two mites? Perhaps 19th century Yale divines could not help themselves to put such a spin on the narrative. In Mrs. Goodman's case, it is too good and also very true. There is much more than meets the eye, and all in a very good way. Who was Mrs. Mary Ann Goodman, and what inspired her generous gift? The Goodman bequest has been noted as the most unusual gift the university has ever received. Why? It was extremely generous for its time. $5,000 in 1872 would equal $124,329.10 in today's market. It was gifted by a formerly indentured African-American woman from Massachusetts who had no real connection to Yale Divinity School. It was earmarked to support young men of African descent in their theological studies, yet the Yale Divinity School of Mrs. Goodman's era did not matriculate students of color. To gain more insight, I sought potential sources of inspiration for her life. I found them in her faith, her family, friends, and finances. Mrs. Goodman's faith and her family were closely interwoven and were important for her during her formative years. The young Mary Ann was brought up in a church-going family in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Although the Brewsters were enumerated as slaves on the 1820 census, they were welcomed as members of the First Congregational Church of Pittsfield. The congregation included their neighbors, the Day family, headed by Gad Day. His sons, George Edward and Horace, were 10 years younger than Miss Mary Ann. Both families moved to New Haven in 1838, and the Day brothers began ministerial studies at Yale Divinity School. The Days became members of the First Congregational Church, familiarly called Center Church, while the Brewsters joined the College Street Congregational Church, which in 1838 met in a church building on Church Street. Mr. Brewster and his new wife, Maria, decided to stay at the Church Street Church after the new church was constructed on College Street. Later, they transferred their membership to the House Street Congregational Church, where Mr. Brewster worked as a sexton after retiring from shoemaking. The church took a hard stance against owning slaves, making it a punishable offense according to their confession of faith and covenant. Church records in the Divinity Library show that Mr. and Mrs. Hopkins, William and Mary Ann, were received as members of the College Street Congregational Church by profession of faith in 1844. The church was located at the site of today's College Street Music Hall. The church covenant asked, among other things, for members to walk in love and charity with each other. It was customary for members to make special monthly contributions to causes and organizations supported by the church. The February 1869 contribution was for education for the ministry. In January 1871, 1 month before Mrs. Goodman's passing, the treasurer's report shows that College Street Church contributed $275 toward furnishing Yale's Divinity Hall. Mrs. Goodman certainly had Yale Divinity School on her radar. The Reverend Simeon S. Jocelyn, a white anti-slavery, anti-colonization, equal rights activist, joined the College Street Church after he finished serving as first minister of the Temple Street African Ecclesiastical Society, now Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church. Reverend Jocelyn's dream to establish a Black college in New Haven was dashed when it was voted down at a town meeting. Still, his desire to elevate families of color to equal status with white families would not be extinguished. He and Nathaniel, his artist brother, with financial assistance from Thomas R. Trowbridge, purchased property in what is now known as the Hill. The village was set up with 9 squares around a central green, just like downtown New Haven. The green came to be known as Trowbridge Square, honoring its largest benefactor. The village of Spireworth, later called Mount Pleasant, became the first diverse community in New Haven, with Blacks and whites living peacefully side by side. The only restriction was that residents were forbidden from selling or consuming ardent spirits. Mr. and Mrs. Hopkins purchased land from the Jocelyn brothers on Carlisle Street in the village of Spireworth. They lived 1 block from Reverend Simeon Jocelyn's family. Sadly, Mr. Hopkins became ill with pneumonia and passed away on October 31st, 1847. His will stated that his entire estate should go to his wife and that he wished her to be the executor. According to the death list for that month, William Hopkins was buried in the city burying grounds, an earlier name for Grove Street Cemetery. However, the cemetery does not have any records to corroborate his burial. The 1850 College Street Church Manual shows that the widow Hopkins was then Mrs. Bradley M. Goodman. Prior to their marriage, he worked as a grocer at 43 Olive Street, which is the current site of Sally's Pizza's parking lot. He was a successful entrepreneur from New York City where he also owned property and where the Goodmans lived after their marriage. Among friends and colleagues, there were those who inspired a spirit of kindness and cheerful giving. Mr. Goodman partnered with Thomas Downing in a catering business known as the Oyster King. Downing was renowned in New England for his many delicious ways of preparing oysters. Word traveled across the pond to Great Britain, where he sent his oysters to Queen Victoria. His restaurant at 5 Broad Street in Manhattan drew large crowds, while his oyster cellar served double duty as a safe haven on the Underground Railroad. Mrs. Goodman became a widow once again, and much too soon. Mr. Goodman's life ended rather suddenly from natural causes on July 28, 1851. She petitioned the New York court to become the executor and was the sole heir. Amongst papers relating to Mrs. Goodman's final affairs, I found a letter simply signed A.C. Luca. Mr. Luca wrote to Reverend Horace Day, then serving as New Haven's superintendent of schools, asking that if a photograph of him and his brothers while children be found with Mrs. Goodman's personal effects, he would very much like to have it, there being no copies in existence. Reverend Day was happy to oblige and shared Mr. Luca's sentiments about the sad loss of a woman so beloved as Mrs. Goodman. There seemed an obvious relationship between these families and well worth exploring. Mr. Luca's father was the organist and choir director at the House Street Congregational Church, attended by the Brewsters. The namesake of his father, Alexander Jr., was one of 4 sons who inherited their father's musical talent. From a young age, the Luca brothers charmed audiences with their singing at abolitionist meetings. Occasionally joined by their mother Lisette and sister Diane, the favorite was boy soprano Cleveland Olmsted Luca, who grew into an exceptional pianist and composer. In adulthood, Cleveland decided to go to the colony of Liberia, where some former slaves and their descendants had chosen to emigrate and teach music as his life's mission. He accomplished great things, including composing the Liberian national anthem to lyrics written by Liberia President D.B. Warner. Upon his return to Ohio, where his family then resided, he became ill with a fever contracted in Africa and passed away soon thereafter. Mrs. Goodman earned her living washing clothes. She was twice a widow, outliving both her husbands, William Hopkins and Bradley Goodman. She added a provision in her will for $100 per year to help care for her elderly father. Mr. Charles Brewster died on December 27, 1871, at the age of 100, 1 month before his daughter, thus negating the provision. Yale Divinity School, then located at the site of today's Hopper College, received the full value of her estate, which, after outstanding bills were paid, amounted to $5,000. In 2023, the market value would be $124,329.10. Indeed, it was everything she had, and quite a generous sum from a woman of such modest means. How did she manage to save this amount? Twice widowed, Mrs. Goodman inherited most of the money she willed to YDS from her husbands and a share in her father's house. An accounting of her assets appears in the papers of the Yale Treasurer's Office. I requested that these papers be digitized so that they soon will be accessible to all in Yale's digital library. The question lingers as to why she gave her entire estate to Yale Divinity School. I believe I discovered the answer in an unexpected buried treasure in the Treasurer's Office papers. Mrs. Goodman's will includes a description of the land on which their home was built at 115 Carlisle Street in the village of Spireworth. It says the property was bounded southerly by Carlisle Street, northerly by land owned by David Van Dyne, westerly by land formerly owned by Nathaniel Jocelyn, and easterly by land formerly owned by the Reverend Dr. James W.C. Pennington, a former slave who desired a degree from Yale Divinity School, but was denied matriculation and only allowed to audit classes from the back where he was not to be seen or heard. Mrs. Goodman surely heard Reverend Pennington's story, as well as Reverend Simeon Jocelyn's failed attempt to establish a Black college in New Haven, and she felt compassion. She knew that her bequest would ensure that no African-American student would be denied a theological education at Yale, nor the degree that comes with it. In September 1872, 8 months after her decease, the inaugural Goodman Scholarship funded the educations of Yale Divinity School's first 2 official students of African descent. Former slave Solomon Melvin Cole's class of 1875 was the first African-American student to officially matriculate at YDS in 1872. After graduating, he served with the American Missionary Association and ministered churches in Texas. James William Morris transferred to YDS from Lincoln University in 1873. With credits previously earned at Lincoln, Morris became the first African-American student to graduate from Yale Divinity School in 1874. Yale Divinity School is pleased and very proud that James W.C. Pennington and Alexander Crummell, Divinity's first and second African-American students, respectively, who did not receive degrees for their time studying here, will posthumously receive the Masters of Divinity degrees they rightfully, though unofficially, earned. Mrs. Goodman's gift ensured a continued Black presence at Yale Divinity School, which grows each year. It has had benefits beyond Yale University, guaranteeing that church pulpits and other non-traditional ministries would have diverse representation and perspectives. Mrs. Goodman's story deserves to be told and retold. It isn't just Yale's story, but New Haven's, and should be a source of great pride for our African-American community. Thank you very much, and I welcome your questions and comments.
Thanks so much, Joan. And if you want to stop sharing screen, we can have a conversation in Q&A. And as I mentioned to folks, if you have questions, put them in the chat. I wanted to start by thanking you for this wonderful talk and the great research that it represents. As you really expressed, this is a story of a great person, but also of a family of networks and communities. And I like how you situate her connections with the legacy and story of Pennington and Jocelyn. The story touches the Hill neighborhood, Spireworth Square, Trowbridge Square, Worcester Square. I think everybody, next time you get takeout or go eat at Sally's, think about the Goodman family having lived there on Olive and Worcester Streets. The connections with Grove Street Cemetery, with YDS, with Contemporary Dixwell Church. So you really sort of, make the point. And my question to you is, perhaps you are, or if you had time, where are the nodes on the network that you are exploring, and or, since we've got a great cloud of witnesses with us and others, that you would encourage others? Where are the further explorations that you see in the archives and in community memory of this story?
Wow. Well, that is a question that is right up my line, and I love, because I love helping to match people with archival sources that will answer their questions, help them learn more about themselves. People say it is not easy to try to research African American people. It can be challenging because they're not always accurately identified, but it is certainly possible, as I have proven, and it's a case of leaving no stone unturned and thinking way outside the box. And so I think those stories definitely need to be told and explored. There is, I mean, who would have believed that in New Haven in the 19th century, we had our own African American awesome singing group that performed all over. They were invited by a white group that also sang abolition songs, and they went on tour together. Those stories have been hidden. I certainly did not know of either of those groups, but it's worth taking the time to find those answers.
Yeah, well, that's great. And we have a question asking about Cleveland, Olmsted, Luca. And again, in the connections, I'd sort of celebrate, you bringing forth the Luca family. The father, Alexander C. Luca, important figure in the life of what's now Dixwell Church, was also active in the abolition movement. He is somebody connected to the 1831 college story and shows up as somebody participating in that. And I'm glad that you sort of have spoken the Luca family in this, because I know our colleague Tobias Cropper and myself, Charles Warner Jr., you, others clearly from the questions in the audience, interested in the Lucas. They were noted in Langston Hughes did a illustrated history of Black cultural in the mid 20th century, and the Luca family is there. As you noted, they connected with the Hutchinson family, of whom there are two, I think, book-length biographies. So there's a need and an opportunity for a Luca family biography, and there are some materials that are available. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more what you know at present about the Luca family, if you know more about Cleveland Olmsted Luca's reasons for going to Liberia, what kind of connections, and if there were further New Haven connections. Talk a little bit more what you know about Luca, and maybe say what you think the research questions about the Luca family should be for people who might be interested in exploring further.
Oh, thank you. Those are very good questions. I do not have it right from his pen or his or anything as to why he went to Liberia. However, there was quite a controversy going on between those who were anti-slavery activists, we'll call them, and those who were colonizationists. And so I know that the people that we talked about in this story today wanted to have end slavery immediately, not gradually, but immediately. Simeon Jocelyn was very much for that, and so still there were those who planned for colonizing parts of Africa. The people were sometimes several generations away from having come from Africa. They had never been to Africa. Maybe their grandparents or great-grandparents had been. So there was a missionary effort for people who wanted to help and bring education to them. These were people who spoke English and knew life over here. If you can find an old map of Liberia, you will see that they actually named different parts of Liberia after places in the United States. And so it seemed to me from knowing what I've learned about the Luca family, that their faith also was driving their decisions. And so Cleveland Olmsted probably wanted to go and be of service and use his music to teach and entertain and do other things in this new colony where people were kind of strangers and trying to set up new lives for themselves.
Thank you for that. As I said, we are truly surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, and there's many comments in the chat and questions, both thanking you for this wonderful presentation. And Professor Danielle McCrae, one of the distinguished, brilliant scholars, asked this question: could you say a bit more about what proportion of Mrs. Goodman's bequest was attributed to the estates of her husbands, and what portion came from her earnings as a laundress?
Well, I would say the majority of it came from her well, I mean, we don't really know if Mrs. Goodman herself may have contributed to purchasing some of that property. She had her own laundering business, but so she came, I think they felt like they owned everything together. And she was the executrix for both of her husband's estates. It would certainly be possible to figure out how much she made every week or month, because in the treasurer's office papers is her little notebook, complete with a pencil attached to it, where she kept her own books. She had the list of all the people that she was doing washing for, and the specific pieces of clothing, and the cost for each thing. So we could figure that out, but I would say just at a glance, as I did going through that little notebook, that it was a modest amount that she was bringing in. So like with many things, land and buildings on the land are the things that make an estate much more valuable than it would be with one's everyday pay.
That's great, and appreciate again the good question from Professor McCrae, as well as your response, and sort of pointing out what resources we have and things that other scholars, students might pursue and add to this knowledge. So thank you both for that. Another great local historian, if she'll allow me to give her that title, because she is, Constance Royster, who's done so much to uplift local history and community memory, asks about the grave site and the gravestone, which was severely damaged and has been restored. And I wonder if you could talk about what happened to the grave, the more recent, what you might know, or ways that Connie Royster and all of us could find out more about that.
Well, I do not know the details of how it was destroyed. So I really can't help you with that, but we can certainly find out. And there would be records, I'm sure, on obtaining a new stone. I think there was, I recall a story that there was one available that they could use, but we can look into that further. The really important point in my research that was intriguing, it said in her in the final accounting of everything that she owned, that with the different pieces of land that they were under her husband's names, but one was a burial plot in the new cemetery. And the new cemetery in 1872 was not Grove Street Cemetery. That had been around for a while. The new cemetery would have been Evergreen Cemetery, and that is where her Mr. Brewster, her father, her stepmother, Maria Young Brewster, and then it was Mr. Brewster purchased that plot in Evergreens with a family from their church, the Howe Street Church, Amos Jones and Eliza Jones. Amos Jones passed away first, and so there were 8 plots in that piece of land in the cemetery, and as it turns out, only 5 of them were filled, and they gave one spot away to someone that was not even related to them. So the 2 couples and then Lucy Griffin was another washerwoman, and apparently a friend of the family, and I think she lived at one time with Mary Ann and her husband, or with Brewsters. So they were sharing this land as people needed it for burials, but certainly there was room for Mary Ann and her one and maybe even both of her husbands, if but Bradley Goodman passed away in New York, so that that probably was not feasible to have him buried in New Haven. But someone didn't read the fine print and assumed that she had no place to be buried, and there's still room there.
Thank you for that. And I put, just as a note in the chat, a link to the Find a Grave listing for Mary Ann Goodman, which includes photos of the restored gravestone, and has a little bit of obituary, so a good record. And I also have put in the chat links to the documentary, What Could Have Been, that Joan had mentioned for those who haven't seen it, as well as a link to President Salave's announcement about the honorary degrees conferred upon James W.C. Pennington and Alexander Crummell. And that statement from President Salave includes some biographical information about those two distinguished scholars and their connections to New Haven and to Yale, and some links to further information. Another great leader of the campus and the Divinity School is Scott Libson, and he asks a question: if you know how many scholarships, Goodman scholarships, have been given over the years?
Well, as far as I understand, it is still being given. I asked in some of the offices at the Divinity School how they keep track of that, if they have names of recipients of it, but I guess because that kind of information is confidential, it's it may be hard to track down, but as far as the story has gone, that I have always heard that at there was money available for at least one, if not more, students of color. Now it's we have actually grown that fund considerably. A few years ago, our director of development, James Hackney, an alum of YDS, made a great effort to grow all of the scholarship funds, and so now we have what is called the Mary Goodman Circle for those who give large amounts to the scholarship funds. So I can't tell you an exact number, but it's still going. And there is an article that you can find if you Google it. Our very own Yale Chief of Police Anthony Campbell went to Yale Divinity School and was funded on the Goodman Scholarship. So we are very proud of him, and he was very grateful for the scholarship.
Thank you for that, and thank you for uplifting and speaking of Chief Campbell, obviously a distinguished leader at Yale, a distinguished and extraordinary as well leader in New Haven, and an important part of the Divinity School community even now. To the question that our colleague and the head of special collections at the Divinity School, Scott Libson, asked, perhaps if Tom Krottenmeier is listening, or Dean Sterling or others, maybe that's one of the things, follow-on storytelling about some of these legacies, both early, and there's been storytelling obviously and research done by predecessors about Solomon Coles and others, but that would be a great project and story, the sort of ongoing lineage down to the present day. So appreciate that. We
Yes.
have a number of other questions. And again, we've got, if you have questions, please post them. We'll try and get to them. Joan, I'm sure, is also happy to be contacted by email. Let me just sort of, one question, which I think is a great question. You know a lot, you found a lot, but anything in particular really stand out for you where, you know, has there been something as you've been going through where you really sort of exclaimed, aha, you know, what's something that really stands out to you of your, as you've gone through?
Oh, yes, I had that moment. It was, I was in manuscripts and archives at Sterling Memorial Library, and it was when I read where the Goodman's property was situated, and the people who lived around that land, and I read the name James W.C. Pennington as one of her neighbors. I almost shouted out loud. So it's I kept quiet, but I I did something like this. That made the story for me, because it brought everything back around. The answered the question, why would she have given all her money to Yale Divinity School? But Pennington's story is very compelling and very heart-wrenching, that he had such a desire to serve in a church and learn to do so, and wanted an education at Yale Divinity School, and at that time was not awarded for his efforts, and it just when I learned that they most likely knew each other and maybe were back fence neighbors or something, that really answered the question. So that's
I appreciate that on many levels. One, a reminder of how important geospatial knowledge is for us to understand history and also be able to connect ourselves with history. Again, Sally's parking lot in the story of the 1831 college, our dear colleague Alvin Ashite, reading through newspapers, came across an article that said Jocelyn had purchased property, which we were able to then say was the property at the corner of Wallace and East Streets. So those sorts of things really make a difference in understanding things, and then you putting them together. And that putting together, you know, that there's not just stars, but the constellation that you're helping us see, I think is really important. And you can think about the legacies of influence. When you think about the Lucas and Dixwell Church, not long after is the story later in this century and into the early part of the 20th century of Helen Hagen, who was a child prodigy musically and becomes the first Black woman to graduate from Yale with a degree in music. And so I think you really powerfully are reminding us of the networks and legacies and streams and influence. So that is really great. And it's exciting to have so many people in the audience interested in Sparked, who will hopefully add knowledge that they have. And it may be, Professor McCrae has asked, you know, are there records of correspondence between the Goodmans and the Reverend Dr. Pennington? And I don't know if you happen to know, but you know, maybe there's further research to be done in Pennington sources back to New Haven. There's a lot more to recover about Pennington's time in New Haven.
Michael, there is always more research to do. That's what we're here for. I do have a little anecdote, speaking again about the Lucas, and then thinking about others who followed, and it's kind of a long thread of people who have done great things in New Haven from our African American community. On Saturday night, there was a concert in Battelle Chapel given by the Greater New Haven Community Chorus. And one piece they featured an 11-year-old boy, and he sang in a boy soprano voice. It was just the most beautiful thing, and all I could think of was Cleveland Olmsted Luca. And this little boy, Wesley McBride, is the new Cleveland Olmsted Luca. He was just precious, and I am sure we will be reading about him and seeing him perform. It was a blessing.
Thank you. We have a question about what was the state of theological education for African Americans and available to African Americans at this time in 1872. Do you know, or might you point people who are interested in knowing more about what kind of seminary education opportunities there were for Black Americans circa 1870?
Well, by that time, because of the Goodman scholarship, African Americans who chose to attend Yale Divinity School would have had the same education as white students. But we do have a complete collection of our bulletins and catalogs describing the curriculum, all the courses they would have taken. We do know that Pennington was allowed to use the library. He could read the books. He just couldn't take them home with him. So everything that was available to white students, and Pennington was there in the late 1830s. So he still had access, just couldn't participate fully, could not matriculate officially and earn a degree. But by 1872, through the scholarship, the African American students were able to matriculate, earn a degree, take library books home, and all of that. So anyone who is interested in the types of courses offered at that time and the professors who were teaching, we have all of that information in our bulletins. So I would be happy to help anyone with those.
Thank you. A couple of notes, and then I'll have one final question for you, Joan. As it relates to the materials, as Joan noted, the treasurer's records have been digitized and will become available, so stay tuned for that. We have been sharing them in real time during Yale College alumni reunions. We had 2 sets twice each Saturday of sessions for alums about the history of New Haven Yale slavery, resistance, and community building, and included all of the materials of Marianne Goodman in those sessions. So more than 200 Yale College alums saw that. Yesterday, we had a program with the International Festival where we went to Grove Street Cemetery and then came to Beinecke and saw the grave sites of people who have papers here, including Marianne Goodman. So we have another number of people see them, and we'll have more events in the fall like we did with alumni for open to the broader community, to the New Haven community, as well as folks who are passing through and folks at Yale. So watch for those kind of opportunities, as well as the digital access we have. I'd also note, in terms of Beinecke programs upcoming, the next Mondays at Beinecke will be on July 17th. So it'll be a ways away. Mike Kelleher, our distinguished colleague who runs the Wyndham Campbell Prizes, will give a preview of the Wyndham Campbell Literary Prizes Literary Festival that will be taking place in September here on campus and around town. So we won't have a Mondays at Beinecke again until July 17th. We will have our annual reading on site on July 5th at 4 p.m. of the Declaration of Independence, Frederick Douglass's oration of 1852, What to the American Slave is Your 4th of July, and other related documents. And we will have our annual display of the Declaration of Independence, Frederick Douglass's oration, and other items of national importance beginning on June 22nd through July 12th. So watch the Beinecke Library website and other Yale websites for information about that display of the Declaration Douglass, as well as the readings on July 5th. And again, thank you all for taking the time today. And thank you, Joan, for what has been a truly excellent presentation, and one that has sparked a lot of curiosity. And I'll close with an open-ended question that flows from ones I've asked, but what are your hopes and aspiration for Goodman studies, and where the Goodman story will go from here?
Well, I am trying to bring it everywhere that I possibly can. I would like to bring it to our New Haven churches, and maybe schools and communities. There are people still living in these communities set up by the Jocelyn brothers, and I think those living in those areas would be very proud to know that they are part of this long thread from the 19th century to the 21st century, and all the people that went before them and will come after them.
Terrific. Well, you have been such a great catalyst for this knowledge, and a great keeper of the Goodman legacy and flame. Thank you so much, Joan. Thanks for taking the time today. Again, thanks everybody in the audience for joining with us. Coming to these is free. The only cost is that you now join Joan in spreading the story of Mary Ann Goodman as far and wide as possible. Thank you all, and thank you, Joan. Have a great day.